Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Washington by Marc Morano. He's the Executive Director and Chief Correspondent of Climate Depot, a project that disputes the scientific consensus on climate change. And from Florence in Italy, we have Svein Tveitdal, the Chairman and Founder of Climate 2020, a climate change consultancy group. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us on the Newsmaker. Sven, let me begin with you. This IPCC report, it's a dire warning. Is it the sort of warning we need right now?
Definitely, it is a dire warning, and it tells us that we have very little time left if we are going to avoid catastrophic climate change in the near future.
So, Marc, we have some of the best scientists reporting to an international panel, taking this very seriously, worrying about the future of humanity, and you don't trust them. Why?
Well, for the very reason you just stated, Sven, you said some of the best scientists. These are scientists that the governments handpick to send to the United Nations. They're scientists, and in fact, the most recent report was written by 91 scientists. And I believe among them was Michael Oppenheimer, who's a climate activist with the Environmental Defense Fund. He's a scientist, but he's also got a serious agenda. He took $250,000 from Barbara Streisand. You have scientists that in the United Nations, which are chosen mostly for their political and ideological ability to persuade. And what I mean by that is they're only going to pick scientists that are promoting climate fears. And a simple way of summing this up is this was a group founded in 1988, the UN IPCC. Yes, it won a Nobel Prize, but it won a Nobel Peace Prize, not for science, but for peace, for political activism. So these scientists in 1988 had to come up with CO2 as a problem. If they find that CO2 is a problem, then guess what? The United Nations, who's in charge of this group, is also in charge of the solution. This is nothing more than base-level political lobbying by self-selected scientists at the United Nations. And in my new book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change, I detail many of the scientists who were former United Nations scientists who turned against the UN because of its alarmism and its lobbying. It's essentially a lobbying organization masquerading as a science panel.
Let me ask you,
that's the problem here.
What's in it for them? What's in it for them if they say, hey, listen, we need to clean up our act, we need to stop polluting our skies, we need to stop burning fossil fuels, which is increasing the temperature. More than 97% of us accredited scientists believe this to be true, that we are responsible for this, right? Let me finish my question. What's in it for them? They're saying, we worry about the future of humanity. We might even have to tighten our belts and possibly even reduce our standard of living in the period before we change to alternative energy sources. It doesn't look like they're making some sort of big bonanza out of this, Marc.
They are, though. I mean, if you go back, first of all, the head of the IPCC was Rajendra Pachauri, the head for many, many years. He was forced to resign in a sexual, discrimination scandal a few years ago.
But again, you're talking about sexual discrimination, Barbara Streisand. I mean, all of this stuff. It's just word salad at the viewers here.
I'm explaining. You asked me what they have. You asked specifically what's in it for them.
Okay, so they're all doing it for one guy.
The panel, the IPCC. No. He said, global warming is my religion. The United Nations is now going to be in charge of the UN Paris Agreement. They're going to be in charge of what they're, in their own words, a complete transformation of society from beginning to end, a centralized transformation. And guess who's in charge of that? The United Nations bureaucrats, planners. This is where they're in charge of distributing the climate funds to which governments are best able to keep poverty and keep energy level and emissions down. They're going to be very important players. And interestingly enough, all of these tipping points began 1864. I document that. We had a professor saying we're going to have climatic doom unless we do something. And in the 1970s, we had the same warnings of doom and tipping points. We must act quickly on global cooling, on overpopulation. We've been there and done that. This is cheap bargaining where the United Nations is saying we will protect you from the climate if all these countries pay up and basically transform our current system, and we'll be in charge of the direction of it. We who believe global warming is our religion, we who they've admitted are at the beck and call of government, and an IPCC vice chair has said we will redistribute wealth by climate policy. This is not even environmental or climate policy anymore. It's redistribution of wealth. There is another agenda at play. You as a journalist can't be this You can't be this naive about it. You cannot be this naive. You just scratch the surface of this. This is a lobbying organization trying to scare us yet again for the umpteenth time. 1989, we had a 10-year tipping point by the United Nations.
Mark, I know you're going to go on for as long as you can. Sven, let me bring you in here. One of the interesting things about this and the age within which we live is that currently the most powerful man in the world, Sven, is probably more aligned with Mark's thoughts on this issue than yours, with Mark's than the vast majority of scientists. And the most powerful country in the world pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord as well. With all of that in mind, are you fighting a losing battle, Sven?
I don't hope so, and I don't hope so because of the humanity. When I was a director with the UN Environment Programme, I had the responsibility for the secretariat to the IPCC, together with a colleague in WMO. And what I just heard from the other person here is simply not correct. And it's good to know that almost all governments in the world is using the reports from the IPCC as a scientific basis for the climate policy they are implementing. So I think it is a big setback actually for the to achieve global climate goals, to limit warming to 2 or hopefully 1.5 centigrades, that the US has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. But most governments are back, and they will hopefully manage to do a better job than we have been doing so far, because we have very limited time left.
Okay, and Sven, the IPCC says emissions need to be cut 45% from present levels by 2030 and almost eliminated by 2050. Is that just pie in the sky, or is that actually doable in any way, shape or form? And if so, how?
Well, I have to say to that it is theoretically possible, but in practical terms, it might not work well out. We have had this knowledge for many years, and if we have started doing the right things 20 years ago, it would have been more easy to avoid the catastrophic climate change that now are in a way approaching very fast. But what we have to do, of course, all of us that believe in what the IPCC and the consensus amongst the scientists is recommending, is to work as hard as we can so that our grandchildren can have a better future than what it looks like just now.
Marc Morano, is there any amount of evidence that can be provided to you for you to accept the scientific consensus that our climate is changing, the Earth is warming, the sea levels are rising, places like the Maldives might disappear very soon, most of our coral reefs will go because of what we're doing, so please come on board so we can figure this out for our grandchildren? Is there any amount of science and evidence that can be shown to you, given that there's so much out there already?
Well, first of all, you mentioned the Maldives and the Pacific Islands. In 1988, they were supposed to be underwater by now, and that hasn't happened. In fact, some of the islands are growing, and they're building airports, and there's no sign of alarm. Here's the thing. There's nothing today that's outside the bounds of natural variability. And I talked to Nobel Prize-winning scientists. I talked to former UN scientists. And I lay this out in my book, a very simple case. Storms, hurricanes, floods, droughts, tornadoes are either at no trend or declining trends on time at climb scales. And that includes, hurricanes and other things we're worried about. Sea level is showing no acceleration. Now, there's dueling data sets. The United Nations will pick different data sets that show, but if you go by tide gauges, there's no acceleration. If you jump to satellite, there is. Temperature, so-called hottest year claims, are well within the margin of error of the data sets. In other words, they're statistically meaningless. It's a fancy way of saying the global temperature has stayed still. We have cooled since the medieval warming period. We have cooled since the Roman warming period of about 100 AD, 0 AD. So in terms of evidence, the extraordinary claims need to be provided on the other side. What the UN did in this report is they basically did a misdirection. They can't point to anything alarming happening now now or anything significant. So what they do is they made a bunch of scarier and scarier predictions of the future, issued yet another ridiculous and clown talking point of tipping points. That's the problem. And by the way, the 1.5 degree limit, one last point, is pulled from thin air. According to Hans Schullenhuber, one of the fathers of this movement, according to Jones, the climate gate scientist, the top UN scientist, he said that he thinks it was pulled from thin air. There's no scientific basis for it, and it's actually a political goal to motivate. We're back to lobbying. People are being deceived. This is a con to lobby so that you can centrally transform governments and put UN bureaucrats basically in charge of the world energy economy.
Something that's interesting for our viewers to decide is whether this is a massive con by the vast majority of scientists and nation states in the world, or if
vast majority.
There might be something at play here and we need to do something about it. Sven, I want you to address something for us very finely. For those who say our way of life is going to be disrupted, we're just trying to put food on the table, we have far more pressing issues like wars in Syria, for example, and that, to Mark's point, the Earth has gone through far more chaotic and crazy periods in the past, ice ages and so forth, so maybe we're taking ourselves too seriously. Maybe we're just going through one of those natural cycles. I want you to address that for those of our viewers who might think that way.
I teach quite a lot now for young children on schools in Norway. And I'm telling them that if you think there has been no changes on the world, I'm saying that you should have been sitting in a spaceship for 30 years and watched the ice over the Arctic. And you would have seen that it has been halved in the middle of September over a period of 30 years, which is maybe the most significant change that has been on Earth for millions of years in such a short period.
Okay. Svein Tveitdal and Marc Morano. Listen, I'd like to get you back on the program in the future, but I've got to wrap and move on. I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
Thank you very much.